Hey, what's up, comrades? Today I thought I'd make a brief video giving my thoughts on third worldism as a tendency. Some of this will be a critique, some of it will be giving an alternative explanation as to why the first world has yet to have its own wave of successful revolutions. The reason why I'm making this video is because after watching Jason's take on Contra and electoralism in the United States, I found some points of his that really stuck out to me. And I'd like to make a pseudo-response to that video, quoting Jason and addressing some of his arguments for third worldism, and give my thoughts and analysis. So if you're a third worldist, please watch this video all the way through before you click the dislike and unsubscribe button. This critique and analysis is in complete good faith, and if you disagree or have any counterpoints that you'd like to bring up, please leave them in the comments section below. Otherwise, I'd like to have Jason on to have a back and forth discussion about this topic and see if we can reach a synthesis. Anywho, let's get started. At the crux of third worldism is the notion that the reason why the first world workers lack revolutionary potential is because they have been placated into servility to capital due to concessions granted by the ruling class over the course of the last several decades, from wage growth to increased living standards, labor laws and rights, etc. The concessions that have been fought for and won by unions and workers' movements of yesteryear have effectively neutralized the revolutionary potential of the first world proletariat. Third worldists hold that there are demographics within the first world that do have class-conscious revolutionary potential, such as indigenous Americans, African Americans, Latin Americans, otherwise the poorest and most disenfranchised groups in society that have the most reason to rebel against it. The problem is that these demographics alone do not constitute a great enough portion of the masses in order to make a popular revolt possible, and it is the third world, that is, the countries that are the most overexploited, underdeveloped, and colonized, that are the ones that are most likely to revolt and have revolutions, and thus it logically follows that we here in the first world should prioritize our efforts in aiding third world revolutionaries into making their revolutions a success, unshackling them from the grip of the Western colonial bloc, cutting the first world off from its source of exploitation, causing the first world to go into crisis, and in turn increasing the first world's revolutionary potential. And if we were to go back in time roughly 45 years, then I personally would be a third worldist, because third worldist analysis at the plateau of state capitalism and Western social democracy in the 1970s could be considered a bulletproof point and analysis. However, the times have changed, and as the contradictions of the system have intensified, as wealth has coalesced more and more into the hands of a minority of elite oligarchs, as these social programs are being continuously cut and defunded, more and more first world workers are descending back into the ranks of the proletariat. And as we shall cover later for a number of reasons, I do not believe third worldism to be up-to-date theory to this day. At the kernel of third worldist analysis is the notion that immiseration is the central prerequisite for revolution, and not the degree to which class consciousness has emerged. The issue with this is that plenty of countries in the third world are poor and have experienced severe crisis, and they have oftentimes been just as likely to flip and descend into fascist reaction as they have into socialist revolution. There are countless examples of this happening as well, from Chile in the 1970s to Pol Pot's Cambodia, to the military junta in Brazil in the 1960s. And yes, I understand in each of these cases the fascist side has had some help from Western intelligence agencies, but the point still stands that the fact that these regimes were able to get the traction that they were in the first place should be a testimony that ideology, not immiseration, is the issue here. And if the masses have been educated to a sufficient level of class consciousness, then these fascist coups shouldn't even be possible from the get-go. Let's look at Bolivia and Venezuela, two countries that have been relentlessly couped and harassed by the United States, and after 4 failed coup attempts in Venezuela, Maduro is still in power. And America's fake government in exile is stuck sitting on their asses blowing millions in CIA grifter bucks down the toilet. Or how about Bolivia, where the socialist government was restored to power less than a year after Evo Morales was ousted in an undemocratic coup? So in short, immiseration, while certainly leading to the mass dissatisfaction with the status quo, will certainly bring people to the point to where they want something new. Without proper ideological education in what that new system would look like, without sufficiently cultivated class consciousness and a well-organized working class force, a nation in crisis will be far more likely to descend into barbarism than they will socialism, as the most reactionary components of the ruling class will use appeals to populism, looking for a demographic or group to blame for all of society's woes, and the masses will be duped by sheer opportunism into believing whatever racial, nationalist, or ethnic spook ends up being scapegoated as for why things are the way they are. People need to come to the understanding that it is the system itself that is the problem, not some Lacantian other. So here is my counter to Third Worldist orthodoxy. It is not the degree of absolute deprivation that discerns a country's revolutionary potential, but the degree to which revolutionary orgs are able to organize, agitate, and educate the masses sufficiently to the means in which effective praxis is utilized. The reason why Westerners, particularly Americans, happen to be so reactionary in a lot of regards is not because they are the benefactors of imperialism, though that is a part of it, but because the United States government have heavily indoctrinated and atomized the general public to such a point to where most people only understand communism to be the right-wing straw man of what the ideology actually is. From Operation Mockingbird to the Red Scare, to decades of anti-communism that has been entrenched into the psyche of Americans to the point to where the idea of having any sort of social services or programs that aren't privately owned is socialism, and socialism bad. It is the narrative that's the problem, as well as the heavy draconian methods that have been used to censor, slander, jail, and deport socialists and communists historically. The increased living standards due to imperialism simply work to legitimize this notion that the system works, and people then take on the survivorship bias since they're richer and more well off than people from the other country that they've been taught to hate, and therefore their system works, but the enemy country's doesn't. A lot of this goes back to the history of labor in America. The reason why older people, i.e. boomers and Gen Xers, are so reactionary is because they lived through the prosperous era of both the hard-regulated social democratic era of the 1960s and 70s, as well as the neoliberal era of the 1980s. Boomers made their money during the 60s and 70s through their good-paying union jobs, saving up decent sums of capital, so that when Reagan came along in the 1980s, he implemented a great deal of policies that were abysmal for American workers, but terrific if you had money and wanted to invest. Millennials and Zoomers, on the other hand, save the ones whom have been born into affluence, have been left behind by this system in its aftermath. Wages have been stagnating for decades. The cost of price inelastic goods needed to participate in society or survive have all been inflated to astronomical degrees. The job market is abysmal, as most states are now right to work and unionization levels are at an all-time low. The subprime mortgage crisis and the COVID-19 crisis have hosed the job security and livelihoods of tens of millions of Americans. Tens of millions of more Americans are food insecure, tens of thousands die from preventable illnesses and poverty-related causes every year in this country, our infrastructure is rotten to the core, and our political apparatus is designed from the top to bottom to block any and all kind of popular reform, and is so disconnected from the concerns of everyday Americans that people want an alternative. People are not happy with the current system. They are not placated. People are more aware of the corruption than ever before, and based on the demographics, the youth in America is overwhelmingly progressive and resonates strongly with socialist rhetoric. The problem in our current conditions is not only ideological, but organizational as well. There is a general lack of class consciousness or working class organizations in the current political discourse, an issue that has only gotten worse in recent decades and is starting to get better. Our movement has effectively been set back to square zero after the end of the Cold War and the fall of the USSR. Communism was delegitimized and the end of history began. But now, 30 years after the end of history, there is growing dissatisfaction with the way things are, for all of the reasons noted. People are alienated, isolated, they're stressed out by bills, stressed out by insecurity, and more, suicidality, drug abuse, and other antisocial neurotic behavior is consistently on the rise, now more than ever before. And with the rampant protesting and rioting in the last year, and the exponentially increasing social instability, we are witnessing the system unraveling before our very eyes. Not to mention the incoming homelessness crisis that is coming in that will leave millions on the streets, evicted in winter during a pandemic. A phenomenon that, once comes to pass, will radicalize a metric fuck-ton of people. Just as Marx predicted centuries ago, the crises are getting worse, the depressions are longer, the recoveries are slower, and the world rate of profit is now trending in the single digits. The only thing the ruling class can do at this time is kick the can down the road, pay themselves, and squeeze the rest of the population for all that they can get. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Our struggle here in the First World is ideological, and in the face of these growing, ever more severe trends, as well as the disillusioned youth, the ideological barriers erected during the Cold War are collapsing, and people are now more and more than ever before receptive to socialist rhetoric. And lastly, I'd like to challenge this point that Americans directly benefit from imperialism. Sure, we're more materially well off because of cheap labor and resources shipped in from the Third World, as well as the degree at which technology and the productive forces have advanced in modern society. However, imperialism benefits the bourgeoisie first and the proletariat dead last. I don't really think imperialism benefits us as much as Jason says. It costs us our brothers and our sisters their lives when they go to fight and die in these pointless adventurist regime change wars. It costs us massive amounts of resources and tax dollars on the upkeep of the global empire. It costs us our earthly habitat, as the military is the #1 most polluting and ecological destructive force on the planet. So where exactly are my benefits? Where's my plunder? Where's my share of the loot, the booty? Where are my spoils from the imperialist plunder? What, because now I can buy a cheap smartphone or a television set? So what? So can people in Africa. Doesn't change the fact that their drinking water is poison.
I've heard Jason quote the statistic that because your average American makes roughly 30 to 35K per year, that when you plug this annual net worth into the inequality calculator, that this puts your average American in the top 1% of the world's population with respect to income. And this is supposed to vindicate the third worldist point that Americans are bought off and are not revolutionary. But when you consider the cost of living and participating in society, you will find that these exceptionally high wages are an illusion, and that Americans' prosperity is contingent on borrowed time. Let's do some math. Let's say the average young adult today makes $30,000 per year after taxes. This translates to about $2,500 per month. Now let us factor in the cost of living, starting with housing. A cheap one-bedroom apartment in most cities will run you about $600 per month, excluding utilities. With utilities factored in, let us add $120 to that figure. That is $720 per month for living alone. Next is transportation. Our hypothetical average American must drive 25 minutes to and from work every day, and because there is virtually no public transit in this country, that necessitates the ownership of an automobile. Most cars cost between $5,000 to $20,000 or more. Let's keep it simple and say that they got theirs for a steal and they have it paid off for brevity's sake. Still, they need car insurance to drive around legally. That's another $120 per month. Next is health insurance. According to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the average American spends roughly $10,000 on medical services per year, with that cost rising year by year. That's another $833 per month, increasing annually at compound interest. So far, we're at $1,673 of monthly bills, and I haven't even factored in gas, auto repairs, groceries, phone bill, internet, etc.
The fact of the matter is that many Americans do not make enough in order to live a secure and fulfilling life. Many of us work jobs that we hate to buy things we don't need. So while it is true that Americans are the highest income earners in the world, we also pay out the ass for goods and services needed in order to participate in modern society and not die. And due to the rising cost of price inelastic goods, many Americans are taking on more and more debt just to keep up. The example I gave with the tenants and the one-bedroom apartments is an example of somebody living within their means. Most Americans actually take on hundreds of thousands of debt for a mortgage, or paying off their medical bills, or going to get the education that they need in order to secure a livelihood for themselves in an increasingly competitive job market.
So while it is true that in material terms, Americans are well off thanks to America being an advanced, fully industrialized, and developed country that is able to dominate its neighbors through its hegemonic petrodollar, many of us actually are quite poor in a number of regards, and the system clearly doesn't benefit us nearly as much as third worldists like to make it out to. At last, we arrive at Jason's take on my take on Contra's take on voting. There are a number of points that stuck out to me throughout this video that I would like to address. Let's get started.
Here's the thing. Everybody back then did the same goddamn thing. Oh, look at Obama saying about how wealth is distributed unequally. Here's Obama saying people deserve to have health care. And they started jumping on the Obama bandwagon just for that. And saying, oh, look, he's not a communist, but he's got this thing that's going to help us. Then you got the CPUSA, which never makes anything better, only ever makes everything worse. And I kept saying, no, you're not going to get universal health care. No, this is not a step forward. No, this is not going to make things better. And then people turned around like 4 years later, 8 years later. Yeah, but we got the individual mandate. We got they have to, pre-existing conditions you have to get covered.
No disagreement here. The CPUSA has been pretty garbage for a while now. The issue here in America is that people still believe that the political system is legitimate. They still grant credence to it and still think that these show elections are the real deal. Only now, where there is rioting and protesting in the streets on election night, people are starting to wake up and smell the ashes. The legitimacy of the system is finally being brought into question, and that has huge implications years down the line, because social instability is only increasing. America is a house of cards, and I don't think people realize how rapidly unstable this country is becoming. Our job, as revolutionaries, as Marxists, is to continue to bring the legitimacy of the system into question and provide people with the alternative that they want deep down, as well as organize a parallel system juxtaposed to the current one.
Main point. That when First Worldists make these decisions, that they're going to participate in elections, not only are they completely violating their own ideology for doing this, full well knowing that it's not going to make a difference. It doesn't. You're only legitimizing the system when you do it. I don't even believe in putting up third-party candidates of a Marxist stripe. Because one, you know they're not going to win, and two, you're only legitimizing the system when you do that. Because you're letting people... We don't live in Marxist time, when things were far more radical than they are now. I mean, you simply cannot compare a Victorian workhouse-living proletarian in the 1850s to an American now. You can't. I'm sorry, it's a ridiculous comparison. We're talking about people who were homeless and lashed themselves to chairs so they could sleep sitting up because there was no room left for anybody to sleep in the workhouses. To an American now. I'm sorry, that is ridiculous. Living standards for Americans are astronomically higher than they were.
Yes, living standards have improved. People do not like to toil and suffer, and yet so many people are toiling and suffering now. There wouldn't be mass protests in the streets if things were stable, Jason. If everything was as peachy as you imply, then the political fabric of the United States wouldn't be ripping from the seams at present. This point right here is something of a non sequitur anyways. What does improved living standards have to do with whether or not we should participate in bourgeois elections? Every single one of the big heads, from Marx to Mao, all saw the validity in it, and even knew that their parties wouldn't win. The point of participation is to gauge the popularity of our parties, count our numbers, and see how well we are resonating with people. Because the more people that are voting third party, the more people we are certain are down for revolutionary action. We have to participate in the political arena one way or another, lest we leave the void that we fill to the forces of reaction. Also, I've got to ask, what is it about the act of voting that validates the political system? As it is set up now, when you vote third party, you're literally protest voting because that's one less vote for the Republicans and Democrats. You're throwing your weight behind, and by extension legitimizing, an alternative political apparatus when you grant them your support. So I really don't get this argument made by Maoists when they say that we should boycott the elections. I get that most people don't vote anyways, but that's because they know the system is bullshit and they instinctively know that neither party represents their interests. But if they knew about an alternative, then they'd be a lot more likely to turn out. We need to be that alternative. And in addition, getting third-party seats in local Congress and local elections couldn't hurt us anyways, because now you have given the levers of power to a committed socialist in your local community.
The victims of imperialism. Because as a lot of people, and I'm going to point to Americans and Canadians on this, and to some degree, UKers, social democracy is still based off the plunder of imperialism. The wars that go on that murder millions upon millions of people every year through not just actual bombs, but enforced poverty, etc., are what fuels social democracy's high living standard.
This is correct. In order to compensate for the loss of profitability caused by paying workers more, providing them benefits, and paying taxes for state programs and infrastructure projects, large corporate firms have had to secure super profits via the super exploitation of the Third World. This is a historical fact, but as I have pointed out before, things have changed. Capitalism cannot even handle social democracy anymore because in order to secure greater and greater profits, the imperialists will inevitably have to come back home and increase the rate of exploitation on their own domestic populace. We're living in the era of neoliberalism, and the failure of the compromise candidate to change things will only continue to throw a rut in the legitimacy of the system. Had Bernie Sanders fulfilled his historic role, we here on the far left would be in a much better position politically than we are now for the same reasons that the far right are in a better position politically because of Trump. So we should still fight for concessions, because if the system fails to reform, that will radicalize people to our side. If it succeeds to reform, then guess what? That still helps us because it gives labor a seat at the table when it comes to economic control, which has deadly implications for capitalism down the line. It's a literal win-win.
It's still there. Even if America went social democratic tomorrow and you got universal healthcare, you got universal education, you're still an imperialist power, and it would still require an imperialist power in order to pay for it. That's how it works. Yeah, but Jeff Bezos is like ... If we just reduced his money, then everything, we would be able to afford it. Okay, first of all, if you taxed Amazon enough to pay for those things, you would literally kill Amazon. Because now the rate of profit on Amazon has now gone down so much lower that you would be essentially accelerating the tendency of the rate of profit to fall.
Yes, and we could use this to our advantage within the context of a severe capitalist crisis because a well-organized class-conscious workers' movement could seize control of Amazon and rein it in to the domain of the public sector, and then profitability wouldn't be an issue anymore. Capitalism at this stage is so fragile it's practically built to fail, and we're in a race to save humanity before it does.
But I get what First Worldists keep saying. Yeah, but we're not in a revolutionary situation where people are willing to fight against the government. I know, that's the point the Third Worldists keep making, that you're not, and you never are. You're not doing it. It's not happening. The First World, even before there was a First and a Third World, the workers in the advanced countries noted a very high tendency not to be revolutionary, and that the more spoils of imperialism that the advanced countries, the First World countries got, the less they were willing to carry out a revolution.
What spoils of war were the Hungarians receiving that bought them off from going socialist during their revolution in 1918? The reason why many of the attempted revolutions in Europe failed 100 years ago were because of bad policies and decisions made by their respective communist parties, as well as a lot of opportunism and backstabbing done by the communists' political allies. Be it the German Social Democratic Party that betrayed the Spartacus League and propped up the Nazis a decade later, or the Hungarian Revolution in 1918, when the Hungarian Communist Party alienated its allies with its hardline anti-religion stance and lack of nationalistic fervor. Revolutions fail or succeed with respect to a broad range of material factors. Nothing is black or white, and we must not be myopic in our analysis and simply blame the workers for not being revolutionary enough.
Nobody in their right mind could possibly compare America today to, the eve of the Soviet Revolution. There's no comparison. Absolutely not. It is ridiculous beyond all measure.
You're right, the system is still relatively stable, but things are changing very rapidly, as I've noted repeatedly before. There are decades when weeks happen, and weeks when decades happen. We must be patient, but we must also be unrelenting in our struggle and our efforts.
We could do a revolution here. Okay, do it. The potential's there. We could do it. Okay, do it. Well, we can't do it right now because people don't want to do it. Well, you just said it was possible. Well, yeah, but the conditions are not 100%. Well, they never are at that level where there would be a revolution. That's the point that we've been making all this time. Because workers in the First World are bought off. Even the workers that are treated shitty in the First World are bought off. I mean, even the workers that are in shitty conditions in America are still bought off enough that they're not willing to do it. You're going to see Boogaloo Boys walking into the streets.
I don't think it's as simple as First World workers being bought off. Yes, through advances in technological development, the productive forces, and economic growth, the general levels of wealth in society are greater than ever before. Again, I think ideology has a lot more to do with it than the general wealth levels of your average person, because as stated before, from the day that we can stand, we're told that capitalism is great, that communism is bad, and that anything wrong with the system isn't because of the system itself, but because of some externalized factor. And as for the revolution comment, Jason, we've been very close to a revolutionary situation in America 2 times now, be it in the 1930s during the Great Depression or the 1960s with the Black Panthers Party during the Civil Rights era. It's just that American communists didn't have their shit together either times to pull it off. For example, in the 30s, the CPUSA relied too much on reformism and fornicated too much with the bourgeois state, and were promptly purged when they were of no use to the American liberal establishment anymore after World War II. And the Black Panther Party was a revolutionary organization in its infancy that was strangled to death in the crib with the killing of Fred Hampton as well as the war on drugs, giving the police a convenient excuse to round up and jail all the revolutionary cadres in the 1970s. Not to mention the ideological war that the ruling class has been waging for literal centuries. People tend to prefer simple answers to complex problems, and it is easier for people to digest a simple lie than it is for them to digest a complex truth. So yes, we have an uphill battle to fight, and the debate stage is slanted in the favor of reaction as a result. Overthrowing a global economic mode that has had centuries to entrench itself, embed itself, and has actively encircled and crushed all alternatives, and has colonized the minds of literally everybody everywhere on the planet is no simple task. If it were really that easy, then somebody would have done it by now. I'm going to skip over the parts where he castigates BreadTube because there's really nothing I disagree with here. Moving on to the DSA meeting.
Portion of that DSA meeting earlier, and it was like the most cringy thing I have ever seen. I am telling you right now, Lenin, Mao, Stalin, anybody Marxist leader would have laughed at that pathetic display. Ridiculous, pathetic display. They would have...
You're not wrong to laugh or rage, Jason. Criticize them if you will, but whether you like it or not, these are the people that we have to work with, and these are the people that we have to educate to show a better way. Radical liberalism is a byproduct of bourgeois propaganda and American individualism and bad political science. These people have the faintest idea to what socialism is and are not well read at all. They just want to make the world a better place, but are strongly misguided and lack dialectical materialism. There are Marxists in the DSA, and if you are a Marxist, it couldn't hurt to work with them because they tend to be very palatable and receptive to Marxism.
Always a guy standing on a street corner on a soapbox or crate handing out a socialist newspaper. It's always some guy on the internet giving an opinion in a YouTube video. Me, and I know that's who I am. I know that's what I do. I'm not under any kind of effing illusion about it. I know who I am. I know what it is that I do. I don't think it's revolutionary. I'm just good at it.
Yes, it's a small action, but it is propaganda nonetheless. I wouldn't be here right now if it wasn't for you and people like you, Jason. You're one of the people who radicalized me, and if this channel project takes off in the way that I hope it does, know that you had a hand to play in that.
That's first worldism. First worldism is when you know revolution needs to be done. You say you're going to do it, you say it's possible, and then never do it. That has been everything from debating our socialism to every first worldist I've ever debated to every argument I've ever had online about it. It is the same thing. Yeah, we'll do it. We just never do it. And the conditions are never there. The desire to do it is never there. I can point to a letter from Engels in 1885 saying there's no workers' movement in the UK. There's nothing revolutionary. I can give you everything that Lenin ever said during the Second International, saying that the advanced countries are not revolutionary and the social democracies are just taking people away from revolutionary potential. During that time, today it's even more. I'm sorry, but the idea that there's any kind of revolutionary potential in...
And where are all those social democracies now? Every last one of them is facing austerity. Those hard-won gains and concessions are going away, and they have to go away in order for capitalism to survive because it is a zero-sum game at the end of the day. The older that this system gets, the lower the rate of profit falls, the less stable and palatable that it becomes, the fewer markets and schemes appear and become available to exploit, the more its mode of production begins to resemble that of socialism. So social democratic reforms are off the table now, and if this is the case, if capitalism is incapable of granting concessions at this stage without it threatening the stability of the global economy, then that leaves us with two options. Socialism or barbarism? And yeah, I saw that debate with our socialism and it was pretty cringe, and I think it was wrong for them to treat you the way that they did. As for the conditions being there and just doing revolution, I mean, what am I supposed to do? Grab a gun and start shooting cops? We're not at a stage where we can do anything resembling armed military struggle, and acts of terrorism at this time will do nothing to advance our cause and will remove us from the masses. It will only alienate people for us to engage in armed struggle at this time. We need the public's trust and we need their favor, and we're not going to get it through pointless acts of adventurism, be it blowing up courthouses, shooting cops, and sabotaging public utilities. So yeah, I think I touched on everything that I want to touch on. I know this video was very long. I just wanted to give my thoughts and criticisms of Third Worldism. Sorry if this video touched a nerve. I hope we can all still be friends in the end after this. If you have any counter-arguments or counterpoints, or would like to debate me on this topic, I will be having an open live stream next Saturday where you can come in and call and debate me, i.e. destroy me Le Epic style with facts and logic. Anyways, I'm done punching left for now. I'm gonna get to work on my next video series on the history of socialism. Shout out to my Patreons, thank you for your gratuity. That is all I have to say for now. Red salute, comrades.